very pleased. Welcome everyone. Tonight we are very pleased to have two speakers for our topic on issue 2, recreational marijuana. The first is Rob Moore. He's the principal for SIOTA Analysis, and he has worked in both the public and nonprofit sectors and has analyzed diverse issues such as economic development, environment, education, and public health. His specialty is applied microeconomic analysis of public policies and the trade-offs between efficiency and equity outcomes in economic development and social safety net programs. He is president of the Gross National Happiness USA, a national grassroots organization promoting multidimensional measurement of well-being in society. Rob began his career as a community organizer in Omaha, Nebraska, and holds a Master of Public Policy from the University of California and a Bachelor of Arts in Philosophy from Denison. Michael Hartnett is a policy analyst for SIOTA Analysis. He has a Master's of Science in Statistics from the University of Minnesota and a Bachelor of Arts in Economics from Bates College. His focus is using advanced statistical methods to better understand the effects of public policies and to promote evidence-based decision-making. They're both going to present the costs and benefits of the issue 2 on Ohio. And Michael's going to begin with an introduction of their methods and then go into he will go into the pros and cons or costs and benefits. And then we want you to feel free to put questions in the chat during the presentation. And then at the end, we will hold the question and answer period. So thank you very much for coming this evening. Go right ahead.
Thanks, Joanne. All right, I will share my screen here. There we go. We should all be able to see the slides, correct?
Yes.
Fantastic. All right. So like Joanne said, my name is Michael Hartnett. Along with Rob, today we're going to be talking about the costs and benefits of issue 2, the recreational cannabis legalization measure. So we've already had some lovely introductions, so I'll breeze through this really quickly, but I have been working as sort of the project manager on our cost benefit analysis of recreational marijuana. Rob has been helping out along the way as well, and is involved in all of our projects at SIOTA. So we've been sort of working on this together, but most of the analysis I've been working on so far. So to begin, I just want to go over, broadly speaking, how we as applied economists think about this problem. And so we always start with what are the mechanics that are going to happen when we legalize marijuana for recreational use. And so the main direct effects that we're going to observe are lower prices first and foremost. Rob is going to talk a bit more about why this happens and what its implications are. But broadly speaking, right, when you legalize something that there's a market for, prices in that market go down. We all understand that there's a market for recreational marijuana that exists. It's just a black market. And in black markets, you usually have to pay a cost premium for the risk that's involved in participating in that market. And in the sort of Econ 101 theory world, that manifests as higher prices. And when you have really high prices for things, you have a lower amount of that good that's in demand in the market. And so when you lower the prices by legalizing it, we see increased usage in the market. This is an interesting point also because the research sort of doesn't suggest that usage is going to increase equally. And age is one of the main reasons for that. So in our, what I write here as old users, that's really what I'm talking about there is the population who this is actually going to become legal for, 21 plus. Unsurprisingly, in states that legalize recreational marijuana, use among that age group increases. Not like super dramatically. Right, a large portion of, well, let me rephrase that. Usage increase, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there are going to be a whole lot of new users. A lot of the increased usage can also be driven by, current users who now have easier access because of the legalization. So it's pretty universally accepted that use will increase among that group. New users will also be brought into the market by like the fact that it's now legal, particularly in the like 18 or like 16 to 21 age range. This is sort of the group of people that aren't legally able to participate in the market, but because it's legal, they have easier access to it. There's a lot of research on how recreational marijuana increases use among college age and like college going people. Part of that is just because academic research is generally easier to conduct when you have, your population of academic students nearby. So much of the research on how use increases in that age range is focused on people who are actually attending college, but broadly speaking, more people in that range are going to enter the market. The last one I want to touch on, which a lot of people care quite a lot about, is how recreational marijuana legalization changes usage among young people. So think people under the age of 16. The evidence here is very mixed. There are some studies that find that in the age range of people from like 8th grade to 10th grade, that there's a slight increase in marijuana usage, but that's not like a universally accepted fact about use among those people. Generally speaking, attitudes about marijuana use seem to change. Like that age group seems to become less like afraid of marijuana use or find it more socially acceptable, but there isn't super convincing evidence that legalizing recreational marijuana means more kids under the age of 16 using marijuana necessarily. The sort of caveat to that is in like very young children, there does seem to be an increase in accidental use. Think parents bringing gummies home and their kids mistaking that for candy. That does seem to have an increase, and we'll talk more about that later when we get into the health effects of recreational marijuana. Lastly, the thing that happens, the final like big mechanical change when you legalize is you get to enact official processes on the market. The two that we're most concerned about are taxes and regulation. The tax revenue of recreational marijuana is a very, very big part of the story that it's going to bring in. And by regulating the market, you can control the externalities from it essentially, right? So when we're talking about things like OVIs or like just negative externalities, negative effects from people not using the recreational marijuana. Regulation allows us to get a hand on that and control some of those things. So I'm going to pass it off to Rob. The next two sections, he is going to talk briefly about the benefits that we found for recreational marijuana legalization, and then I'll come back at the end to talk about some of the costs. So Rob, take it away.
Thanks, Michael. And something to I'll just start off this by saying I really appreciate working with the League of Women Voters and, presenting to y'all. Y'all are a great audience for this kind of stuff. And I love that y'all are very engaged in, wanting to know what the impacts are going to be of public policy that you're going to have a direct choice in next month when we all go to the polls and vote on this. I've been a member of the League of Women Voters. I think my membership's lapsed right now, so I think I can get my membership in pretty soon. But I've been a member off and on since 2014 when I was living in Omaha, Nebraska, and I was involved in the League of Women Voters of Greater Omaha there. And I had heard about the organization and said, got in touch and said, "Are men allowed to join?" And I was there like very much like, "Yes, you're definitely allowed to join," and we encourage it. So I really appreciated getting involved, and I ended up running a redistricting study in Nebraska back then. And even before that, I was working on the this was the 2012 redistricting reform vote that had happened here in Ohio. That the League of Women Voters of Ohio was one of the members, I mean, one of the like main supporters of, and we're still having that fight today, obviously. So yeah, I appreciate all the work and y'all being really involved with this. And something I'll note with this, I'm gonna be going over benefits here, but this is a little bit different from like a pro-con type of discussion because we're not advocates, we're analysts. We are policy analysts, so we're trying to look at both sides of this. So I'm giving the pro here, I mean the benefits, and Michael's giving the costs, but obviously we're kind of both looking at both sides of these as we go through. So it's a little bit of a different discussion, but hopefully a discussion that's helpful for y'all. So yeah, as we talk about this, so basically, the way that we as economists look at a core benefit of any policy is this concept called consumer surplus. And basically that is like a quantitative measure of how much of things people get that they want. And this is really a like core benefit when you talk about legalization of anything, is that people are going to be able to get access to things that they want access to. This is basically how our economy works, is that people go out and they spend money on things that they want. And GDP is kind of our like really basic way of measuring the strength of the economy. And that's how many dollars are trading hands throughout the economy, which means how much are people able to make trades that get them more of things that they want. So when something is legalized, it makes it easier for you to get things that you want, which a lot of people want to be able to consume, medical cannabis, recreational cannabis. And we basically measure that by seeing how much people would be willing to pay for something, then what the actual price is, and then everything that they, the difference between how much they'd be willing to pay it and the price, that's how much consumer surplus is generated. So basically, if you would be willing to buy a car for $20,000 and you can buy it for $10,000, then you get $10,000 of benefit by buying that car. So when we're going out measuring how much benefit there is from legalization of marijuana, we're going out and measuring how much people would be willing to pay versus how much they will pay, and looking at the difference between those two and measuring that. So the core, I'm giving you a little bit of like microeconomic theory here, but the basic idea here is that people will get more of things that they want. And from an economic standpoint, that's good. People being able to get access to things that they want. When you have a tax, and basically making something illegal is a form of a tax, because you are increasing the risk that people have for participating in that market. If you purchase recreational marijuana right now, or if you sell recreational marijuana, you're putting yourself at risk of fine and potential imprisonment. And that, from an economic standpoint, that's a tax. That is a cost that you are taking on by paying in that market. When you legalize something, you're taking away that cost, which then will decrease the price of it and increase consumption. So our first benefit that we're looking at is people just getting more of things that they want, which, from an economic standpoint, that's a benefit. Go to the next page, Michael. So getting away from that core benefit, another benefit that we get is tax revenue. Now, from a like pure social perspective, tax revenue doesn't really change anything, because basically what you're doing is you're taking money from one group of people and you're giving it to another group of people. So we call that a transfer. That's just there's no benefit on net to society if you just take money from some people and give it to other people. But there is a net if the people that you give it to create social benefits. And that's actually what we're modeling in our cost benefit analysis, what Michael has been looking at. In the legislation that's being passed, there is an earmark for these dollars to go towards different funds 36% of the tax revenue that will be generated, which it's written as a 10% tax. 36% will be going to this social equity and jobs fund, which will basically be something that will a fund that will be funding programs to try to help people who were affected by the justice system in the past because of either incarceration or some sort of penalty because of them consuming marijuana in the past or selling. 36% will go to this cannabis facilities fund. 25% will go to the substance abuse addiction fund. So we'll be spending some money on trying to reduce addiction on anti-addiction programs. And then 3% will go towards the Division of Cannabis Control and Tax Commission Fund. This is basically administrative overhead because we're going to have a whole new state agency to regulate this. So OSU actually just came out with an estimate. There was a center at Ohio State that estimated that Ohio would generate around $200 million in tax revenue per year from this 10% excise tax, which is pretty substantial from a state perspective. I mean, that's a chunk of change. So these will be funding these programs, and these programs have certain benefits associated with them. And we don't need to get into the details of how we modeled those, but this is a social benefit for us to be spending this on things like social equity and job creation programs. Next page. Second, there's going to be jobs that are going to be created. We're going to have an industry that taking away that tax of things being illegal will make it so that there will be a larger market, which means more people will be able to be employed. So based on similar states, Ohio is likely to have about 2,000 to 3,000 jobs in the recreational cannabis industry. They'll be created by this policy. Go to the next page, Michael. Another thing is we're going to see less arrests associated with, because there will be a substance that'll be contraband that will not be contraband anymore. We're going to see arrests in other states. We've seen arrests drop significantly for people over the age of 21, though not as much for people who would still be illegal to consume. But if you have fewer arrests, that means less use of police resources. It means less burden on the criminal justice system. That means have to pay less on public defenders, judges, lawyers, etc. Also, reduction in costs for people who would be arrested. So people who taking part in the system means you have to often pay your own lawyer or pay fines. Also, less jail and prison time, which has some pretty significant social costs. If you are arrested and you have to spend time in jail, that means that it deteriorates your social capital, it makes you less employable, and you're able to care for people who are children who you may have in your family less. There are a lot of social costs to jail and prison time. And the research, interestingly enough, we haven't found in similar states that have had recreational marijuana legalizations, we haven't seen a improvement in racial disparities in arrest rates from legalization, which means that there still seems to be legalization in itself doesn't seem to be closing any gaps in racial differences around incarceration. Let's go to the next page. Another thing this is not a benefit. Well, it leads a little bit more benefit than cost. So we put it in this category, but there's some mixed research on how marijuana use impacts alcohol use. Now, alcohol use is the third highest preventable cause of death in the United States, behind cigarette use and sedentary lifestyles. About 90,000 Americans die every year from alcohol use, whether a lot of those being liver, but also motor vehicle accidents, murder. There's a lot of different social problems that are associated with alcohol use. But there's competing evidence in the literature on whether legalization of recreational marijuana will have an impact on alcohol use. There's sort of two schools of thought. One is that marijuana use is a substitute for alcohol use. This is basically like, I don't want to drink tonight, instead I'm going to, smoke weed. Under this scenario, it means that alcohol use would go down, and that health outcomes would improve because less people would be drinking. And there'd be fewer of these negative externalities like car crashes and murders that are associated with alcohol use. But there's another school of thought, which is that marijuana is a complement. That if people are smoking marijuana, they're more likely to also consume alcohol. Under this scenario, alcohol use would go up, health outcomes would worsen because people would be drinking more, and there'd be more negative externalities, more external costs associated with this. And from what Michael has found in his research, it seems like there's evidence for both of these, and we're not really sure exactly what's going to happen in Ohio. But depending on the direction it goes, it could have a decently big impact. I know there is some research that medical marijuana legalization has led to less alcohol use among people with depression, and has actually been shown to reduce male suicide rates in some states. So that's medical, though, and it's different from recreational marijuana use. So we might not exactly see the same thing. I think that's my last slide. So we'll go ahead and move on to costs, and Michael will then go over the social costs that we're looking at.
Alrighty, so the first cost we're going to talk about is the impact that recreational marijuana legalization has on workers' productivity. This is a concern that I can't remember where I've seen it, but I'm pretty sure at least one special interest group, in response in particular to issue 2, has brought up this idea of decreased productivity as a reason why you should vote against it. And there is evidence in the literature to suggest that productivity in some sectors does actually decrease once you legalize recreational marijuana. One study we were looking at from 2017, which was focused on the mining, construction, arts, entertainment, recreation, and accommodation and food service sectors, found that on average, productivity decreased by about 1% per worker. This is looking at the entire industries as a whole. So when you think about a 1% decrease in productivity, that might manifest, that almost certainly doesn't manifest right as everyone becoming 1% less productive. It's much more likely that 1 in every 100 people misses work because they're using marijuana, and so you lose productivity that way. But it averages out to about a 1% loss in productivity. One interesting concern that this brings up for the job market, or one sort of economic thought that might happen is, well, if productivity is going down, the market will replace those less productive workers with more productive workers. There's a bevy of these are industries that workers can join, and new workers would be happy to join into, but in the job market, right, there's some stickiness. It's hard to replace people, and there's overhead associated with training new employees. So we probably actually wouldn't this is a problem that in the long run might correct itself as 50 years into the future, these industries might select away from users who are going to be less productive because of their marijuana use. But in the short term, we actually probably will see a decrease in productivity. And 1% also seems like a small amount, but these are industries that are fairly important to society and have a lot of productive value. There's a question in the chat from Anna Banks. Was productivity studied for other areas in addition to the 4 areas noted? In this study, the answer is no. Other studies have looked at productivity across other sectors. The results there were less conclusive, mostly because the other studies that look at productivity try and measure it on a sort of individual level, like how much do individuals who use recreational marijuana lose productivity? And that's just a harder question to answer from a data perspective. This study is what we based our models off of in our cost benefit analysis, and we prefer it because it looks at the industry as a whole and sort of takes the industry average. So in short, mixed evidence about other industries. We particularly found this study to be convincing for its effect on the listed industries there. Another big cause of concern for many people is OVIs. And I'm from Minnesota, so in my part of the world, these are DUIs. I'm not sure if that's everyone in Ohio just knows what an OVI is, but it's operating a vehicle impaired, driving drunk, essentially, or driving high in this case. And there is, in fact, evidence to suggest that increased use will lead to increased OVI rates. That is, unsurprising. Just if you have more people using marijuana, the odds that some of those people are going to get behind the wheel of a car are just going to increase. It's not perhaps as substantial an increase as you might think. The literature thinks this effect is pretty small, all things considered, like a little over a 10% increase in most cases. And if you think about marijuana, it's not necessarily, the way people use it isn't the same as the way people use alcohol. You can't like go out to a place, like there aren't bars where you can go out and drive to, and then you have to get yourself home. And in Ohio in particular, only a quarter of OVIs are drug related. And there's a question in the chat. Does this 25% include alcohol or other drugs? This is strictly other drugs. When you look at Ohio's OVI statistics, they actually break it out into alcohol-related OVIs and drug-related OVIs, with no further distinction on what drugs is. So when you think about this quarter of other OVIs being related to drugs, that's sort of an upper limit for how many are marijuana-related. They could, in theory, all be marijuana-related, but much likely if we're just talking about strictly the marijuana-related OVIs, that's sort of the upper bound for how many there are in Ohio based on the data we have. And so we will see an increase in the OVIs, and that will lead to more, some of it will just be more people being pulled over. It will lead to more car accidents that deal damage, and it will, in theory, lead to a more loss of life due to OVIs each year in Ohio. It's one of the more significant costs that we were modeling. Finally, the last one that we want to touch on here tonight is the health impacts of increased marijuana use. And this is more of the individual health impacts for people who are users. First off, it's not on the slide here, but I just want to talk about the evidence that there is about how long-term marijuana use affects individual health. And really the point I want to make is that we don't really know the answer to that yet, because this is a sort of a newly regulated substance, and there isn't a ton of really, really, really convincing long-term research about what happens to people who regularly use marijuana. There's some evidence that it can cause, heart problems later in life. This certainly falls into the literature of people who just inhale things for those who smoke marijuana, and the effects of it smoking just on your lungs long-term. But specifically with marijuana and cannabis, the long-term health effects are still sort of TBD. But in the short term, we do know that emergency room visits increase slightly in states that have legalized recreational use. One of the interesting things about this statistic, though, is that, it's that emergency room visits are increasing across the country, even in states that don't have recreational marijuana legalized. This is probably because, as states across the country sort of piecemeal start to legalize recreational marijuana, people's attitudes about it are becoming, the public opinion is changing, and more people are just sort of using it even in states where it is still illegal. So there is this further increase that we observe in states that legalize it for recreational use. But even in states where it's not, there's still, a slight increase. So exactly how much of this is attributable to the legalization and how much of this is just the changing of people's attitudes, is sort of hard to decipher. The other piece here that's important is a big, well, not necessarily big, but part of this increase emergency room visits is what I was talking before about unintentional use, for young children especially, who you go in thinking, oh, weed gummy is candy and eat it, or a brownie or whatever it may be. That population is also going to see a specific spike in emergency room visits, sort of greater than the just regular users who are moderating themselves, their intake. So those are the costs and benefits that we've been looking at in our research. And now, if anyone has any, we can open the floor to some questions. So we got a
I
question.
see one from Kay that says, some folks think marijuana is a gateway that leads to further and other drug use. Do you have any research on that?
So this is somewhat similar to what we were talking about with alcohol use, where does marijuana sort of, from the economic perspective, is it a complement for the use of other, like, more damaging drugs? And this is a situation where the research is, again, mixed. On one hand, you might think that the people who use marijuana are going to have, a greater tendency to want to use other drugs, or perhaps if you think about it the other way, people who aren't using marijuana are probably not going to be people who use other drugs. I think perhaps a more salient point is that with those other much more damaging drugs, especially in the case of opiates, what leads people into that type of addiction is usually not the same thing that leads people into choosing to use marijuana recreationally. Whether it's, a serious injury that leads to an addiction, or, something else. I think it's probably anecdotal. It's probably true that the people who don't choose not to use marijuana are also going to choose not to use other drugs. But I think the question of does it lead as a gateway, I think it's more convincing to say that the reasons that people choose to do other more damaging drugs are not necessarily the reasons that people choose to use recreational marijuana. The next question, how many cannabis-related arrests are there in Ohio now? So crime data is really, really hard, because when we talk about crime data, we're almost everyone is going to source the FBI's UCR, their Universal Crime Report. And that is a system where individual police agencies report to the FBI how many arrests they make and for what reasons and all of that. And so the reason it's unreliable is because it requires each police station individually to report, and there's no mandate for them usually to do that. That being said, the most recent count in Ohio was about 6,000 for 2022. So I think it was 6,600-ish. So sort of mid 6,000-ish range of reported cannabis-related arrests.
Something on the gateway drug question. There was a study that was published in the Journal of Experimental Criminology last year, done by a couple of Boise State criminologists. And what they did was they looked at the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent and Adult Health, basically this like big survey of health in the United States, and looked over time at marijuana use and how it potentially impacted other illicit drug use. And they did 18 different tests to see if marijuana led to use of other illicit drugs, and only found significance in 6 of the 18. And among those 6, only 3 of them were substantial significance. So their conclusion was basically that marijuana use is not a reliable gateway to illicit drug use. It's not something that it can, but it's not something that necessarily leads to illicit drug use. And they were particularly interested in prohibition policies and seeing if prohibition of marijuana was a good way to reduce use of other illicit drugs, and their conclusion that it wasn't.
Thanks for that, Rob. Question here. I joined late, so you may have covered this. Will the amount a person can purchase be regulated? I believe the answer to that is no. I forget. I've read through the exact wording. Maybe I can look this up very briefly. But I think the answer to that is no. I think there might be limits on the supplier side, but I think the individual consumer is no. If I find the answer to that, I will certainly come back and say that with certainty. But the next question, is a legalization likely to decrease the cost of medical marijuana? That's a really good question. I think the answer is probably either no or by a very small amount, because the medical marijuana industry already exists and is regulated. The reason the price would come down would be because there are more suppliers and more choice for those people, right? They could go to any dispensary and get what they were looking for, as opposed to needing to just go to one. But certainly that will be a much smaller decrease than for the people who are currently consuming recreationally and illegally. Okay, next question here. What is the process for detection of marijuana if stopped by the police while driving? And the statistics that share that the arrests for African Americans did not show a decrease, was that an overall statistics or was it related to the legalization of marijuana? So for the first part of that, I don't know the answer. I was using statistics from Ohio's OVI dashboard, and they don't have any sort of methodology for explaining how they get their statistics or what the process is. I imagine, if you get pulled over for an OVI and you get brought in, I imagine that they're going to do a toxicology report, and if you have marijuana in your system, that will be it. Beyond that, I don't know. That's just a guess on my part. As for your second question about the failure for legalization, well, I'll just go from the beginning, right? The statistic of interest here was when recreational marijuana is legalized and there's a decrease in the number of total arrests, what we don't see is a change in the rate of those arrests that are people who are African American. So right, we don't see. You would think that because in our current system, African Americans are disproportionately arrested for this, you would think that they sort of disproportionately receive the benefits of there being fewer arrests, and that's actually not something that's observed, which is very interesting. That is specific to states that legalize recreational cannabis. The study was looking at what happens to those arrest rates in states that do legalize and how does the equity split work afterwards. And they found that, in fact, it does not improve. And there is even some slight evidence that it got worse in some places. Medical marijuana is pretty restricted. Do you think recreational will be used for conditions outside the allowed medical reasons? I think in short, yes. I live in Minnesota, a state that has legal recreational marijuana, and just sort of anecdotally, it seems it's very easy to get. Anyone can get it. You can get it basically anywhere at any time, as long as you are of age and have a valid ID. So I think the recreational legalization is basically just saying there are no more restrictions. As long as you are over 21, you can get it and use it for any reason. The issue allows for homegrown cannabis. Any information on how often this is done in similar states? That's a really good question and something we were really considering looking into. The short answer is we don't have that information. It's actually very, hard to find reliable sources of how much or how regularly people grow their own cannabis. The only way you really see it crop up is when people are breaking the limits for how much they can grow themselves and get arrested. That's actually a big chunk of the arrests that stick around after legalization for recreational cannabis. So in short, no, we don't really have any information about how often it's done, but interestingly, it's a big chunk of the arrests that we continue to see. Excuse me. Another question here. Would supplies and jobs for legal cannabis be from Ohio? I.e., are there rules against transportation across state and national borders? I believe the answer to that is yes. Well, let me rephrase. I think the rules against transportation are, I'm pretty sure I know that if you can't go to Ohio and buy legal recreational marijuana and then take it back to a state where it is illegal. So I guess this is a question about the supply side, which is different. I don't entirely know about how the supply chain works for the recreational marijuana industry. I imagine that much of it would just be internal because, we have this black market industry that already exists. So the supply already exists in Ohio. I think it would be more of an issue of bringing that supply into sort of the regulated world, as opposed to, say, go and getting, marijuana grown in other states and just selling it in Ohio. That's my suspicion, but Rob, do you have something to say?
Yeah, one thing that matters here is federalism. I mean, marijuana is still illegal at the federal level. So because the federal government, has the constitutional right to regulate anything with an interstate commerce implication, these markets really need to stay pretty localized. That's not to say that people aren't going to Michigan and buying recreational marijuana and then bringing it back. Of course, they're doing that a lot, but that's mainly happening after retail purchase. That these goods are flowing across state lines. The supply chain doesn't have a lot of flexibility to move across state lines because of the federal regulation and federal prohibition, and that's going to continue to be a problem. And honestly, businesses don't really want to take a lot of risks when it comes to interstate commerce on that because of that. I mean, this is just another example of regulation acting as a tax. It's making it difficult for the market to work across states, which should keep this pretty localized within Ohio for now. Who knows if federal prohibition will be lifted at some point, but it's hard to get anything done at the federal level the way that the federal politics are right now. Other questions or discussion? I mean, you can drop in the chat. You can also unmute yourself and ask a question if you'd like. Anna asks, would the federalism also affect marketing and advertising? Yeah. I mean, I don't know what kind of law there is about advertising in this bill. This proposed bill. Michael, do you know anything about that?
I don't think it mentions advertising specifically. Excuse me. This is actually sort of an interesting discussion that happens among the sort of advocate side of this. A lot of people in the advocacy world are worried about the marketing and advertising side. I sort of imagine, this is just me spitballing, but I imagine that the regulation is going to, if it isn't already written into the law, it's going to very quickly go the way that tobacco and alcohol of prohibitions about marketing towards children and all of the things like that. But yeah, you probably can't run an ad for recreational marijuana in a state where it's still illegal.
An interesting thing about alcohol advertising is that there's actually no law against marketing alcohol to children. it is a self-regulated industry where the manufacturers of alcohol, the brewers and distillers across the country have pledged to not market towards children. And there are actually some researchers who have shown how incorrect this is, and have like shown that a lot of the like, for instance, TV shows and like places that advertising happens are places that are specifically targeted towards people under age 21. So there is no official regulation, and there is a public pledge by all of the alcohol companies to not market toward children, but they still do it. Another distinction that's worth keeping in mind with this law, with this potential, with issue 2, a big difference between issue 1 and issue 2, which those of you who are in the know probably know this already. Issue 1 is a constitutional amendment. Issue 2 is only an initiated statute. So what's that mean? It means issue 1, the reproductive rights amendment, if that goes through, then the state legislature can't touch it on their own. While if this marijuana legalization initiative statute goes through, the legislature can go through and change it however they want to after it passes. They'll have every legal right to do that. So what we're seeing in this bill might end up being very different from what the actual policy ends up looking like down the road, because the legislature might go back and want to make changes afterwards. I see another question here. Tiffany's asking, how will this law deal with the cash market that these businesses will have to operate in? How do you ensure the correct taxes are collected in the law? Are there ways of regulating revenue reporting that you know?
I think, this, I don't think there's anything particularly different about the recreational marijuana industry and its tax collection, excuse me, compared to any other sort of, regulated industry, assuming that it would be regulated, that is. I think probably what you would actually end up seeing is that a lot less of this would be done in cash. You would just be seeing businesses and dispensaries trying to they would be trying to look like every other business around, and they would be, using credit cards, and this would just fall under the purview of like any other sort of tax initiative. I think that, not reporting your revenue would be tax fraud. That would just be plain and simple, and the legal processes would be the same.
Yeah, and it does provide some problems for credit, though, because I know a lot of credit card companies don't want to extend credit for things that are extended that are prohibited federally. And I don't know, I haven't made a purchase in another state of any of these in the past few years or anything, so I don't really know if that is, but I know that, like, I lived in Denver actually in 2016, right after it was legalized in Colorado, and I know that it was cash purchased there at that time. So I don't know what it's going to look like when it comes to here. I assume that you won't be able to use credit cards, but I don't know. Our tax collection, we were actually happy because OSU came out with their estimate of how much taxes were going to be collected pretty soon after we did our estimate, and we came to a very similar conclusion. Probably because we were both basing them off of estimates we've seen in other states, and basically like using that as a basis. So the biggest answer to this is other states are doing it, so people are figuring out how to do it somehow. The like more technical answer is that there's going to be a whole new bureau, a new agency that is created through the statute that will be in charge of taking care of this administrative side of it. And that's what that 3% that we talked about earlier, what the taxes are going to be spent on is going to be funding, is that new agency. Okay. Well, if we don't have any other questions, then thank you so much for your time. Thanks for getting together and talking to us about this. This was a great conversation to have. Michael, I don't know if you have any last words you want to say.
Actually, I'm just gonna answer one last question that popped up in the chat here before I do that. Sorry to go back on your word there, Rob.
Okay.
We create ballot issue briefs. We don't go to the level of detail your research provides. Did you have an opportunity to review our brief? And could you think of anything we had included in the pros and cons? I didn't have an opportunity to review the League of Women's Voters brief before we were doing our research. We started this project quite a while ago and have, sort of been slowly calculating these estimates. But, based on the fact that you guys were willing to listen to us sit here and talk about these things that are, just deep in econ theory, I imagine that your brief probably hit most of the points. And anything that we've included in here today, I think from our perspective, these are sort of the, we try and be as all-inclusive as possible as we can be in our research. So we think that this is sort of a, it's not a complete list. You can never get a complete list of all the costs and benefits, but we think this is a pretty comprehensive list. Yeah, and as Rob was saying, really, really appreciate that you all took the time to sit here and listen to us. It's always great to have the opportunity to actually take our research that sometimes we do and throw off into the wind. It's nice to actually get to talk to real people who are interested in the issues and who are excited about going and making informed decisions at the polls. So thank you very much for that.
We appreciate your approach too, because it's very akin to the League of Women Voters with the pros and cons and allowing the voter to decide and an educated voter to decide in which way they want to do it. And this really helped a lot with some of the details. So we do appreciate that.
Yes, thank you very much, Rob and Mark.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. All right, and thanks to everyone for coming tonight.
Remember, tomorrow is your last day to register. I know you're all registered, but we can start to vote on Wednesday.
Yes.
So
Okay.
it's exciting.
Yes. Okay, thank you. Good night.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Everybody.